let's imagine we're talking in 2040, and the world really made startlingly good progress in reducing CO2 emissions and reducing climate risk. We're really at the very best end of where we thought we might be back in 2020. So what, imagining we're in 2040, what in your view were the key actions that really did put us on the track to the best possible climate outcome, say by 2040? What made a difference?
Yeah, so we're in 2040, and I still look so young. But looking back to then, when we, spoke 20 years ago and we were talking about what it would take to make progress, I think what's really been key was the fact that we had at that time this vicious cycle of basically we couldn't get to bipartisanship on climate. We couldn't bring everyone along. And so what we had, remembering back then, was we had most of the messengers on climate in the 2000s and around the time that we call the climate wars back in Australia. They were all called, we would identify them as progressive or left wing. And it was really quite rare to see people on the conservative side of politics, whether that be voters, politicians, speaking up for action on climate. But what happened was we had this really amazing leadership from our community, from all sides of the community. So we had not just your traditional progressive voters, but we had farmers who were traditional National Party voters, and we had, obviously the young people were key in really inspiring a lot of this leadership. The climate strikes that you might remember were so visible back then, but both that and a change in the way that stories were shared on climate, with people really being able to see the impacts that were happening, not as environmental impacts, but as something that was a human story that affected all of us. And then we had a movement that actually found a place for all of us. And so those traditional divides on climate, people realized that this was bigger than your old left-right political divide. And we had a movement that was made up of people with all different political backgrounds. And that inspired leadership from your more conservative politicians. Actually, there were a few champions you might remember back in 2020, Matt Keane, the New South Wales Environment Minister, he really risked some of his political capital on climate, and over the following few years, that combined with pressure from this broad movement inspired other more conservative politicians to actually be really courageous, in the same way that the marriage equality campaign had mobilised politicians on the conservative side of politics as well. We saw the same thing happen with climate. We saw the National Party lose some of its traditional seats where they had those blockers on climate that just weren't going to change. A lot of really amazing regional independents ran, lots of women entered politics and really changed the dynamic. So I think we had change in our political sphere. And I also think, looking back, we can see that the campaign around global finance was really critical. So this was happening in the 2019, 2020 as well, but banks refused to lend to new fossil fuel projects. And that was, again, pressure from their customers and their stakeholders. Insurance companies refused to insure new fossil fuel projects. Without insurance, they couldn't get off the ground. And asset managers refused to invest in new fossil fuel projects. So we had this whole shift in the global financial system, which of course had implications for us back in Australia. So we had the political shifts, we had big shifts in the global financial system, and then we also had huge cultural change. So we started to see climate really affect our stories as a society, and we had incredible artists and filmmakers and musicians change the way that we thought about it in the cultural zeitgeist, and that's harder to kind of point back and go, it was this film or it was this song, but that there was just a change in the way that our culture kind of dealt with the issue. So I think it was probably those three things: political, cultural, and financial system shifts that really got us to the point we are today of basically avoiding the impacts that we couldn't manage and managing the impacts that we couldn't avoid.